Affect positive change, dig it. Universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. 2 G's per month, the work we running. Bottom up economics, get the money coming. Now dig, time to change the economic system. No more poor and middle class victims. Poor and middle class pockets getting fatter. Money for the least of these is what matters. Bottom up economics is where it begins. Rich folks get profit on the back end. The poor and middle class spend the money. The spent money stimulates the economy. Everyone benefits from bottom to top. When poor and middle class cash money drops, we talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. Corrupt corporations. What's up, everybody?
Welcome to BGMG Radio with Byron Goines and Meshelle Goines.
Let's get into today's lecture entitled The United States, Socialism and Regulated Capitalism. Now, I'll prove that God utilized socialism in the Old Testament to help the least of these, just as the United States is utilizing socialism today to help the least of these. God utilized socialism in the law given by God to Moses for the Israelites, as stated in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 34, which reads as follows. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. The Israelite community was commanded to tithe the produce of the land and livestock, so Levites, strangers, fatherless, and widows could eat. The means of production and the distribution of goods were collectively owned and administered by the Israelites. And all Israelites contributed to the system for the common good. The Israelites were commanded to tithe the produce of the land and the livestock to the Levites, and the Levites and Levite priests were to offer a tithe or tenth of the tithes that they received from the Israelites to the Lord. The high priest would offer the Lord's portion as a burnt offering. The Levites were given all of the tenth in Israel as an inheritance, as stated in Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, which reads as follows. And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance for their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. The commands are for all Israelites, as the Lord is speaking to the whole nation of Israel, including the priests, as proven in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, which reads as follows. For I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. The Lord specifically states who he is speaking to. The sons of Jacob are the descendants of Jacob, who are the Israelites, which includes every tribe of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel by the Lord in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, which reads as follows. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. The word meat in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 is the word teref in the Hebrew, which is defined as food. In the book of Malachi, God tells all of the Israelites through the mouth of the prophet Malachi to bring all of the tithes of their produce of the land and livestock into the storehouse so that there may be food in the Lord's house, which is exactly what the Israelites were supposed to do. And the food that the Israelites supplied through their tithes fed the Levites, the strangers, the fatherless, and the widows, as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29, which reads as follows. At the end of 3 years, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. God clearly commanded socialism in the law, which went as far as feeding strangers in the land. Today, in the United States, they're known as undocumented immigrants by those on the left, and they're known as illegals by those on the right. Malachi chapter 3, verses 11 through 12, continues to explain what the Lord will do for Israel if they tithe the produce of the land and livestock, and reads as follows: "And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts." This goes right alongside the latter part of Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29, which reads as follows: "And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest." Now the Israelites had blessings to look forward to if they stopped robbing God, which they were definitely doing, as stated in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8, which reads as follows: "Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings." All Israel had to do was follow God's commands. But robbing God in tithes and offerings brings a curse on the whole nation of Israel, as stated in Malachi chapter 3, verse 9, which reads as follows: "Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation." Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 goes right alongside Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29, as Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 reads as follows: "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." God commanded socialism in the law to provide food for Levites, strangers, fatherless, and widows. Socialism clearly worked in a theocracy then, just as socialism clearly works in the United States democracy today. And remember, just as in United States government socialism, concerning God's command for Israel, the collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods were through the Israelites. In other words, the means of production and distribution of goods were collectively owned and administered by the Israelites. Also, the Israelites collectively contributed to the system through their tithes of their produce of the land and livestock, and it was a common good system. As the Israelites collectively contributed to the common good of all Israelites and included strangers in the land, as their tithes of their produce of the land and livestock supplied God's food program. And that is what the tithing system was. It was God's food program, just like the United States federal government SNAP food program and the old food stamps program that existed prior to SNAP. Food programs exist to ensure that the least of these have food to eat. Now, for an in-depth study about tithes, listen to our lecture entitled The Tithe Debate. Now, as I conclude today's lecture, I'm going to show you how God addressed capitalism in the Bible. Remember, the United States has federal government regulated capitalism to deal with corrupt capitalists. Let's look at how God dealt with corrupt capitalists. Because under God's law, capitalists were commanded to follow God's commands. And if they did not follow God's commands, they were in trouble with God. First, let's cover some verses in the Old Testament concerning capitalism in the King James Version of the Bible, as capitalism is a system of exploitation and oppression, and today in the 21st century, employers are still exploiting and oppressing the workers. Under the law that was given by God to Moses for the Israelites, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13 reads as follows: Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning. In other words, the employer is not to cheat the worker and rob the worker of wages. The employer is not to hold on to the worker's wages until the next morning. The worker is to be paid by the employer. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14 reads as follows: Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. In other words, the employer is not to oppress an employee who is poor and needy, whether the employee is a fellow Israelite or a stranger in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 15 reads as follows: At his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. In other words, the employer is to pay the employee on the same day, before the sun sets, because the employee is poor and in need of the money. The consequence of the employer not doing this will result in the employer committing a sin. Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 13 reads as follows: Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. In other words, woe to the employer who receives labor from the employee and refuses to pay the employee. Malachi chapter 3, verse 5 reads as follows: And I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his rank, and fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts. In this verse concerning employers, in the part of the verse that states, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, God is saying that he will draw near in judgment and be a swift witness against employers who oppress their employees in wages. In other words, employers who oppress employees in wages will have to answer to God for their actions. Now, these verses that I just read were law for the Israelites. As I stated, the law was given by God to Moses for the Israelites, and the Israelites were to follow the law. God specifically laid out the way in which employers were to treat employees and the consequences for employers who refused to follow the law and exploited and oppressed their employees. These verses are straightforward, and employers were under God's command concerning how they were to treat their employees. God's law did not allow the exploitation and oppression of employees, and employers who engaged in exploitation and oppression were dealt with by God. Now, just as capitalism in the 21st century is a system of exploitation and oppression, where employers exploit and oppress workers, capitalism in the Old Testament was a system of exploitation and oppression, and was addressed by God in his law that was given to the Israelites through Moses, as corrupt employers were specifically addressed. In the Old Testament, commerce and trade existed. People engaged in business and would buy and sell goods. People hired workers for their labor. Employer and employee relationships existed. Capitalism clearly existed, although the word capitalism did not exist. Now, let's look at some information concerning capitalism in the New Testament during the time of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13 reads as follows: And Jesus went into the temple of God, and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said unto them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. In these verses, capitalism is clearly evident in the temple of God, as there were money changers and buying and selling going on in the temple. And none of this should have been going on in the temple. As a result, this corruption was addressed by Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul defined corrupt capitalists throughout the generations of time. And the words of the Apostle Paul still hold true today in the 21st century. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, the Apostle Paul stated the following to his protege, Timothy. Verses 9 and 10 of 1 Timothy chapter 6 reads as follows. Verse 9, But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Verse 10, For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Both verses address the mind of a corrupt capitalist. Let's look at verse 9. It's clear that corrupt capitalists will do anything to get as much profit as possible, as the temptation of potential unlimited amounts of money and profit is what drives corrupt capitalists. The historical list is long of corrupt capitalists in prison for corruption, as a result of the temptation of unlimited amounts of money and profit to be gained through illegal activities. In verse 10, the Apostle Paul stated that the love of money is the root of all evil. He did not say some evil. The Apostle Paul stated all evil. And this is clear concerning capitalists and capitalism. As I stated earlier, the United States has regulated capitalism. The word capitalism, without the word regulated in front of it, is referring to a phrase utilized by capitalists around the world, and the phrase is laissez-faire capitalism, or in other words, free market capitalism, which are both referring to an economic system consisting of private or corporate operation with no government interference, as I stated earlier, which would enable a corporation to monopolize an industry and run roughshod over their employees in order to get as much profit as possible. Also, remember that in the economic systems of capitalism and regulated capitalism, workers are exploited by employers and workers are oppressed in their wages. And this is done by the employers for profit. Today in the 21st century, there are corporations that hire employees and pay them low wages in order to get more profit. And these same corporations that pay low wages to their employees sell their goods and services at higher prices to get more profit. As a result, these corporations squeeze more profit on both sides of the economic equation. They extract profit from the low wages they pay their employees, and they extract profit from the higher prices they charge for their goods and services. For these corporations, it's about getting as much profit as possible through all means available. Now, let's look at some more scriptures in the New Testament. James chapter 5, verses 1 through 4 reads as follows. Verse 1, Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Verse 2, Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Verse 3, Your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat of your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Verse 4, Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. In the first three verses, it is clearly evident that the capitalists were rich and people of wealth. In verse 4, it is clearly evident that the capitalists have capital invested in their business. The capitalists have undoubtedly invested in land and have hired workers to work the land and have not paid the workers. So that James chapter 5 verse 4 is clearly understandable, let's read this verse using the New International Version. James chapter 5 verse 4 reads as follows. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. In James chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, as a result of the corruption of these capitalists, they chose not to pay their workers. And corruption is nothing new concerning capitalists and the systems of capitalism and regulated capitalism. Remember, in the United States, regulated capitalism is the system on the private side, and socialism is the system on the government side. The United States has a hybrid economic system. You dig? Visit us online at bgmgradio.com to get today's lecture. We thank you for your time. Did you dig today's broadcast? Contact us at bgmgradio.com and let us know. If you're listening on YouTube, click subscribe so you can be notified about new uploads.
Thank you for listening to BGMG Radio with Byron Goines and Meshelle Goines.
To effect positive change, dig it. Universal basic income. Poor and middle class people gon' get some. 2 G's per month, the work we running. Bottom up economics, get the money coming. Now dig, time to change the economic system. No more poor and middle class victims. Poor and middle class pockets getting fatter. Money for the least of these is what matters. Bottom up economics is where it begins. Rich folks get profit on the back end. The poor and middle class spend the money. The spent money stimulates the economy. Everyone benefits from bottom to top. With poor and middle class cash money drops. We talking about universal basic income. Poor and middle class people go